Alright, so it's been some time now since we've learned the full length of Final Fantasy XVI's campaign. I believe it was sometime last year where they told us that it would run around 35 to 40 hours in length. And thanks to a recent Famitsu article, which was translated by Audrey on Twitter, the developers have once again reiterated that the game is going to clock in at around 35 hours in length. Now, this length has some people on the internet in an uproar. Again, it's the internet. People get outraged all the time. There's people complaining that it's too short for a Final Fantasy game. It's gonna blow chunks. It looks bad. It's gonna be a repeat of Final Fantasy 13. The sky is falling. How could you guys do this? But I'm here to say that 35 hours in runtime is probably the perfect length for this type of game. Now, the wording in this article is a little bit confusing, so we kind of have to dissect that to really kind of figure out what the heck is going on. But early on in the interview, Yoshi P states that there's around 11 hours worth of cutscenes, and that's main story cutscenes. That's not including cutscenes that take place during or after battles. And then towards the end of the interview, he does reiterate once again that it will take about 35 hours for you to understand the meat of the story and complete the game. So to me, that kind of sounds like 11 of those 35 hours are going to be dedicated to cutscenes, which means the main game is going to clock in at around 24 to 25 hours in length. That to me sounds absolutely perfect for an action game, which is what 16 is. It has RPG elements, but it's primarily first and foremost an action game. So while it is possible that those 35 hours is purely for gameplay, based on what I'm reading, it does sound a lot like those 11 hours of cutscenes are going to be included in the 35 hours of the game's full runtime. But I could be wrong on that. Now let's compare it to a game that had a pretty big influence on the development cycle of Final Fantasy XVI, and that is God of War 2018 and to an extent God of War Ragnarok. Now, if you're just going through the story stuff for God of War 2018, it's going to take you roughly 20 hours to finish the game, compared to Ragnarok, which will take you about 25 to 25 and a half hours for just main story content. Now, my personal playthrough of God of War 2018 is about 32 hours in length, but that's a little bit inflated because I did a lot of side questing and I decided to fight all of the Valkyries, including the Valkyrie Queen, which took me probably a lot longer than it should have. So in reality, my playtime of that game was probably 25 hours long. Compare that to my playthrough of Ragnarok, which took 63 hours, and that's including main story stuff as well as side questing stuff, because I fought all of the super bosses, including the new Valkyrie Queen, which probably took a couple of years off of my life. But that's not the main important issue here. The main thing is that both games are roughly 5 to 5.5 hours different in terms of their length, and that makes a really big difference in terms of the game's pacing. So God of War 2018 felt perfectly paced at 20 hours. From start to middle to finish. Not once did I ever feel like that story dragged. Not once did I ever get tired of combat or level design or enemy design. It felt so perfect, especially the size and intimacy of that game's story. It felt just right. It was a father and a son going on a journey to reach a destination, and it felt perfect. Now, comparing that to Ragnarok, as much as I love that game and had so much fun with it, there's a lot of points in that game's story, mostly towards the end, where the pacing starts to kind of go off the rails and it feels like, okay, we're just kind of wasting our time. We're doing stuff that just feels like it's padding out the story, which isn't necessary at all. Ragnarok kind of starts off like you're ice skating on this really beautiful lake, and then maybe about 2/3 of the way in, you fall into a pool of mashed potatoes, and now you're wading your way through those mashed potatoes trying to find a way out. And once you do find your way out, you slip and fall downhill and boom, you're at your destination. It happens very quickly in that game. So the pacing, even though it was just a 5-hour difference story-wise, really made an impact on how Ragnarok felt in a negative manner, in my personal opinion. As much as I love those characters and the combat, the story just felt like at some point in time, I wanted it to just pick up the pace instead of spinning its wheels. So again, to me, a Final Fantasy game that is not open world, that is level-based with large biomes, clocking in at 24 to 25 hours is probably going to be absolutely perfect for this type of game. Any longer and you risk the game becoming repetitive or having issues with pacing. And they've said from the very beginning that Final Fantasy XVI story-wise is going to be a roller coaster ride where once you get on, that bitch ain't stopping. So that to me signals that they found the perfect pacing for that story for its characters and how to tell it in an efficient manner without anything feeling like it's dragging or feeling like it's too short. Yoshi P states, when the game development was just starting out, I had the idea in mind that gamers these days are really busy with other things, so I wanted them to be able to at least aim to complete the story, which is true. A lot of people will sometimes sit down, play a game, maybe get halfway through it, and then they get tired of it because it's just taking forever to get going. So it really feels like they've meticulously plotted out this game's development, not just in terms of its mechanics, but also in terms of its storytelling. And if even then the game is not enough for you, they reiterate that there's going to be 70 to 80 hours worth of side content. Side questing to your heart's content for 70 to 80 hours sounds like a dream for people who think the game is way too short. And on top of that, there's going to be a new game plus mode called Final Fantasy mode, which is going to be much more difficult and varied than the main game's difficulty. We're talking end game enemies now showing up way earlier in the game, different enemy formations, which means that there can be different battles as well. And there is going to be the inclusion of leaderboards. So if you want to feel like you're the best Final Fantasy player in all of the world, you can compete in that on those leaderboards. So the replayability factor outside of the game's main story seems pretty huge so far. So all in all, what I'm trying to say is the runtime for this game sounds like it's going to be perfect, especially since it's an action game. A longer story doesn't necessarily translate to being a better game. And I don't think people should be too worried right now that the game is too short. But that's the video. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you guys think? Do you guys think that the game is too short? Are you worried about the game's runtime? Or do you think it's going to be just fine? I am Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.